والصلاة والسلام على خاتم النبيين وسيد المرسلين أبي القاسم محمد
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
أما بعد أوصيكم وأوصي نفسي بتقوى الله. I exhort you all, and I exhort myself first, and I exhort you all to have taqwa of Allah, to be cautious of Allah, to be wary of the rights that Allah has over us at all times. What's very interesting when you look at the Quran and the way that the day of Qiyamah is described, it's described in many different ways. For example, one description of the day of Qiyamah is Yawm Fazar al-Akbar, on the day in which there shall be great grand terror. Another description given for the day of Qiyamah is Yawm Yafirru al-Mar'u bin Akhihi wa Ummihi wa Abihi wa Sahibatihi wa Banihi, and etc. The day in which a person shall run from his brother and his friend and his mother, etc., etc. A day which is full of fright. But what's very interesting is we have a specific hadith. I can't exactly remember who from. I believe it's from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. And this hadith really stands out because it gives a different perspective of how the day of Qiyamah will be for the muttaqi, for the person who has piety. It says, Al-Qiyamah urusul muttaqin, that the day of judgment will be like a wedding for the believer, for the muttaqi, for the one who has piety. And it's an interesting description that the Imam is giving, that we know the day of Qiyamah is a day of fright, and that's how it is introduced. Another description that the Quran says about the day of Qiyamah is يَوْمَ تُبْلَى السَّرَائِرُ, on the day in which all the secrets shall be exposed. Everything that we did secretly, that will be apparent for everyone to see. And the onlookers will be looking at our actions thinking, wow, you actually did that? This is who you really were? But for the muttaqi, that day will be like a wedding. Inshallah, may Allah make that day a source of happiness and more fun than our wedding in this world. So to continue what we discussed last week we said, inshallah, during the first khutbah of the few weeks that I am blessed to be with you, we will talk about the search of knowledge. And to summarize very quickly for those who weren't here last week, and also just to recap what we said last week, we said when we look at the life of the Prophet, there are a number of miracles that stand out. One is that the Quran stands out, other miracles that happened during the time of the Prophet. But there's one particular miracle that we looked at, that historians look at, and that is that the Prophet had a transformative experience with the people around him. He transformed them from a people who were tribal, warring, bloodthirsty, willing to jump at each other's throats over the smallest of issues. He transformed them from a very tribal, small-minded people into a people that could be called a community, a civilization. And in fact, the Quran even mentions this. وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكَ. When you were enemies, remember Allah's blessing upon you when you were enemies, but Allah made you ikhwan, Allah made you brothers. And we have examples, we gave examples, two examples. One, before the life of the Prophet, there was a 40-year war between the Arabs that started over a camel. And I won't go through the details, but there was a war that started over a camel, and the Arabs fought each other for 40 years. But if you look after the life of the Prophet in the Battle of the Yarmouk, there's an incident narrated where Muslims were being attacked in the war. There were 3 wounded Muslims. People came to give water to one. That one person who was wounded said, no, give it to the other, etc. The Arabs had been transformed from a tribal society into one which was based on brotherhood. And we looked at what was one of the factors that happened. What was one of the factors that led to this? And we said that Islam and the message that the Prophet brought stood out from all other religions. Why? Because there is a unique, absolute emphasis on knowledge. And we discussed 6 traditions. One of them was طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ فَرِيضَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ. That the search of knowledge and the seeking of knowledge is a farida. It is wajib upon every Muslim. So inshallah today we're going to continue that. So we've established last week that within Islam there is a message on every single person to study and to seek knowledge. The seeking of knowledge isn't delegated to one specific class. The seeking of knowledge isn't designated to one specific group of people. That if they seek knowledge, we are now exempt from seeking knowledge. This is a generic command on everyone, that everyone is required to go and learn knowledge. So now we want to ask the question, what knowledge is being spoken about? Now, one tradition that I touched on last week, but I'll bring again today, Imam as-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says, he says, alaykum bit-tafaqquh fi dinillah, that upon you all is the requirement to do tafaqquh fi dinillah, to think deeply, to spend some time reflecting on the religion of Allah. Then it continues, وَلَا تَكُونُوا أَعْرَابًا, and don't be like the Bedouins. This is Imam as-Sadiq saying this, 100 years after the Prophet had come. He's reminding the people that before you, there were people who didn't know anything about their religion. They simply inherited a faith, and they acted upon that faith that they had inherited without any form of reflection or contemplation. وَلَا تَكُونُوا أَعْرَابًا, don't be like the Bedouins. Now the Imam continues, فَإِنَّهُ مَنْ لَمْ يَتَفَقَّهُ فِي دِينِ اللَّهِ لَمْ يَنْظُرِ اللَّهُ إِلَيْهِ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. And a person who fails to do this, a person who fails to think about his faith, who reflect on his faith, Allah will not look at him or pay any attention to him on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Now again, this is quite a powerful tradition, quite a heavy tradition. What does this mean? Does this all mean now we all have to give up our jobs and start spending our whole lives dedicated to the deen of Allah? Is this what the hadith is actually referring to, or is it referring to something else? When we understand our deen, Islam, our belief system, we know it is split into two sections. We have the usul and we have the furu'. The usul relate to those parts of our faith that form the foundation, that form the skeleton, those beliefs that are to do with God, for example, with prophethood, with imamah, with adala, and with qiyamah. This is the usul of our deen. Then you have the furu' of your deen, which is the practical side. Things that are to do with how you act, how you interact in this world. When it comes to the usul, what is very interesting is our ulama categorically say that when it comes to these usul, there is no such thing as following someone. There is no such thing as I believe in God because so and so scholar believes in God. Or I believe in imamah, I believe in this because so and so scholar believes in God. And in fact, Sayyid Sistani in his Tawdih al-Masail, in his Islamic laws, rule number 1, you can see it in the English, you can see it in the Persian. He says there is no taqleed, there is no following someone else in the fundamentals of your faith. There is no delegation of our intellect, of our ability to think when it comes to the fundamentals. Now obviously when it comes to the furu', when it comes to the practical side of things, there's a different discussion. Obviously we leave that to we leave those discussions to the experts. But when it comes to the fundamentals of your faith, it is not acceptable for someone to simply say, I believe because so-and-so told me. And this is the type of tafaqquh where the Imam is talking about. That when a person thinks deeply and he establishes this foundation for himself, and he is convinced of God, he is convinced of the Prophet, then he becomes a real believer. Can we recite a salawat, please? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And in fact, we have a beautiful tradition from Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says, النوم في اليقين أفضل من عبادة على الشك. That a person who sleeps in a state of conviction, certainty, is better than someone who prays while he's in doubt. Showing the value that conviction holds. That a person can spend his whole life praying, but deep down he doesn't know who he's praying to. Deep down he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know the value of what he's doing. He's doing it because perhaps there's societal pressure. He's grown up in a religious family. As soon as he steps away from that religious family, what will happen? It will crumble. That's why the Imams and the Prophet emphasize that when it comes to your deen, you need to be convinced. You need to be strong. And in fact, we have, again, number of sayings from our scholars. I will quote one scholar in particular, Mahdi Naraqi, in his book, very famous book on akhlaq called Jami' al-Sa'adat. He makes a very interesting statement. He says, وَمُجَرَّدَ التَّصْدِيقِ مِنْ غَيْرِ إِتْمِئِنَانِ الْقَلْبِ. Simply to have these things in your mind, بِغَيْرِ إِتْمِئِنَانِ الْقَلْبِ, without that conviction being in the heart, غَيْرُ كَافٍ لِلنَّجَاةِ فِي الْآخِرَةِ. That it is not sufficient simply for your salvation in the next world. Sure, it may help you in this world. Sure, you may be considered on the apparent as a Muslim. Sure, you may be practicing as a Muslim. But that is not going to suffice you in the next world. And it reminds me of a story that the ulama of akhlaq would always repeat. And you might have heard this before, so apologies if you have, but I'll repeat it because it's a very nice reminder. There was a religious man who had a parrot. And he taught this parrot how to say different adhkar. And he would teach it different adhkar, people would visit and they'd be like, wow, this parrot is amazing. This parrot is so beautiful. We love to hear it recite the adhkar of Allah. We love to hear it recite different names, different adiyah. And people would visit just to get that enjoyment of hearing that word, praise Allah. Then one day they came to visit, the parrot had died, and they saw the religious man who was the owner of the parrot was sad. They said to him, why are you sad? You know, the parrot had a good life. He had to go one day. Why are you upset about him going? He said, I'm not upset that he's going, it's the way that he went. He was attacked by another animal, and at that moment when he was attacked, all the adhkar that he had remembered, nothing came out. Instead he started squeaking and squawking and making this noise, and the man said, what happened to this parrot? I trained him for that day. But at that time when he needed it, nothing remained. So similarly, our focus, our emphasis is that when it comes to the core beliefs, one should be firm. And simply because we repeat things ad verbatim, that shouldn't be our criteria of the knowledge that we have. Can you say salawat, please? Okay, so that was the first point. What knowledge is being referred to in these ahadith? So we established, or we looked very briefly, and I appreciate that these discussions are quite lengthy, so I'm trying to summarize it as much as possible. If there are any ambiguities, please excuse me. But the focus on these traditions is that we need to be strong in our deen. We need to be strong in our faith. Now, does this mean that all other sciences are not included within these traditions that we have? Does it mean that when the Prophet and the Imams are saying, go seek knowledge, that excludes all the secular sciences, all the professions, everything else? Here we have other scholars saying no. In fact, when the Imams and the Prophet would mention ilm, they would do so with two meanings in mind. One is the meaning that we spoke of, and the other meaning is that they recognize that people need to go and learn a profession. People need to be able to live in society. They need to be able to be doctors. They need to be able to be engineers. This is how society will flourish. So, for example, commenting on the tradition that we have, أُطْلُبُ الْعِلْمُ وَلَوْ فِي السِّينِ, go and seek knowledge even if it's from China. One scholar, Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi, he says, فَإِنَّ هَذِهِ التَّوْصِيَّةِ غَيْرُ نَاظِرَةٍ إِلَىٰ عُلُومِ الدِّينِيَّةِ. That this advice that the Prophet is giving isn't just focused on religious knowledge. بَلِ الْمَقْصُودُ عُلُومِ الدُّنْيَوِيَّةِ. But actually what is intended by this is the earthly sciences, the secular sciences. That's those sort of sciences that we wouldn't necessarily classify as religious. And what's very interesting is if you look at China in the 7th to 9th century when the Prophet was alive and he was saying these traditions, you see that China was being ruled by a dynasty called the Tang dynasty. And the Tang dynasty was known for ushering in a golden age of civilization, of culture, of arts within China. So again, there is some interesting wisdom behind what Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi is trying to give across here. Ayatollah Taqi Mudarrisi, for example, he says, وَلَقَدْ كَانَ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَآلِهِ يَبْعَثُ أَصْحَابِهِ إِلَى الْيَمَنِ. That the Prophet would send his companions to Yemen. Interesting. He would send some companions to Yemen. Why? لِيَتَعَلَّمُوا فُنُونُ الْحَرْبِ. So that they would learn the art of warfare. وَتَعَرَّفْ عَلَى بَعْضِ الْأَسْلِحَةِ الْجَدِيدَةِ. So that they may go and learn the art of warfare and learn how to use some new weapons that were being made. This is, Ayatollah Taqi Mudarrisi would say this. Again, why are they saying this? There is sometimes a emphasis within certain circles that the only sciences that are important are those that strictly relate to religion. And again, we accept that. We've shown that if a person isn't strong in their faith, as the hadith said, Allah will not look at them on the day of Qiyamah. But at the same time, we cannot neglect that the Prophet himself and the Imams emphasized us learning secular knowledge. That knowledge which will help us in society and flourish. So that's the second point. Do these traditions also refer to knowledge other than religious knowledges? We can say yes, and the ulama agree to this. Now, the third thing that we want to discuss is the idea of being aware of our times. Being aware of the times in which you live in. So when we look at that hadith about learning knowledge, we see many things mentioned. We see the fact that one should learn knowledge. We see the fact that one should learn knowledge even if it puts themselves at hardship. We see the fact that one should travel far for knowledge. We see the value of the one who learns knowledge. We see the value of the scholar who has knowledge. We also see an interesting category of hadith that speak about the value of knowing the time that you live in. Why? Why is it important to know the time that we live in? Inshallah, we'll get into that. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says, in a tradition found in Al-Kafi, he says, عَلَى الْعَاقِلْ أَنْ يَكُونَ عَارِفًا بِزَمَانِهِ. That is, it is upon every rational person, every intelligent person, and inshallah we'll all hope to be amongst that description, a rational person, an intelligent person. If someone calls us a non-intelligent person, we'll get a bit offended by that. The Imam is saying, عَلَى الْعَاقِلْ أَنْ يَكُونَ عَارِفًا بِزَمَانِهِ. It is upon every intelligent person to be aware of the times that he lives in. Socially, what is going on? Culturally, what is going on? Ethically, what is going on? Politically, what's going on? It's not simply good enough to simply know our deen. How do you implement that deen in the time in which you live in? Another tradition we have, al-alimu bi zamanihi la tahjum alayhi al-lawabis. That a person who knows the time in which he lives, he will not be frightened by its confusion. Because sometimes when things happen in society, we get taken back. Like, what's going on? How did this happen? How could they have done this? When did this happen? How am I going to be able to practice my faith with this going on? Etc. A person who is aware of his time is already steps ahead. He knows what's happening. He's comfortable with what's happening. He doesn't have an inferiority complex that if something's happening in society, he has to accustom himself to that. He has to incline towards that. He is confident to say, لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ وَلِيَ دِينِ. And lastly, أَعْرَفُ النَّاسُ بِالزَّمَانِ مَنْ لَمْ يَتَعَجَّبْ مِنْ أَحْدَاثِهِ. That the most knowledgeable person with his time about the time that he lives in is the one who isn't even surprised when new things happen. Sometimes, as a parent myself, I speak to other parents and they say, did you know in school they're teaching this? I'm so shocked. When did this happen? I say, where have you been? In 2005 they introduced this into the curriculum. It's 2024 now, you're concerned? It's good that you're concerned. But how are you getting concerned now, for example? How is it just now you're now thinking? You're on the back foot now. Here the Imam is saying, the Imam is advising, he's giving you a method that simply having knowledge isn't good enough. That's half of it. You need to be able to understand the time that you live in and how to implement it. And that being said, we'll finish the first khutbah here. Inshallah, in the upcoming weeks, we'll look into certain issues that we have in the times that we live in. What sort of cultural issues are going on? Ethically, politically, morally. How do we combat that? Inshallah, we pray that Allah gives us the tawfiq and the yearning to learn knowledge and to become ambassadors for His faith. Our time is short. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين والصلاة والسلام على محمد وآل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. So just before I start the second khutbah, there's been a request if some of the brothers can move forward. I can see a couple of gaps at the front. With a loud salawat, if some of you wouldn't mind just shuffling a little bit. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So on Tuesday this week, we all saw the news that Lebanon was hit with an act of state terrorism. There's nowhere else to say what happened. Thousands of pages that had been rigged with explosives detonated all over Lebanon, leaving many dead, injured, suffering very severe and serious wounds. Many civilians, children were dead, health workers, women, mothers, wives. The attack was indiscriminate. And if that wasn't enough, on Wednesday there was round two. Walkie-talkies were exploded. And there were reports of other electronic devices exploding. Radios, TV sets, in particular solar panels, which is rather very interesting. And what we saw is this act was condemned by some countries, not all. Belgium released a statement saying they found the attack despicable, and they called it a violent act, indiscriminate act. Brazil did the same, Slovenia did the same, Malaysia did the same, China did the same. And obviously I'm not mentioning the Islamic countries because we assume that they condemned. Algeria condemned. This was the indiscriminate blowing up of electronic devices, the rigging of electronic devices. And as the days have passed since, news is coming out about how it was done. The latest is that Israel had spent 15 years in trying to master this act of sabotage, which again, they had no ability or no way to know in whose hands these equipments were, whether or not they were civilians nearby. So again, an act of terrorism, as we will easily understand, an indiscriminate act that violates all forms of law. However, across our media, unfortunately, Western media, that in Britain, that in the US, in other countries in Western Europe, the way that this attack was spoken about, you would think that they were talking about a long-lost piece of art that they had just discovered. It was jaw-dropping, it was spectacular, it was shocking, it was stunning, it was a work of mystery. It's almost as if the journalists describing it were getting excited when they were describing what would happen. An act of sabotage, children were dead. The insistence that no, everyone targeted was a combatant. Based on what? As we know, the propaganda is of atmospheric levels at the moment. The same way they created a propaganda over beheaded babies and killed children, they are now repeating a similar thing by saying everyone who had this device was a combatant. Not necessarily. That's not proven. In fact, first-hand accounts from Lebanon say the otherwise. You have health workers being attacked, mothers, women, children. In fact, some of the dead were, in fact, children. And this was an attack that exposed many things. The brutal nature of Israeli terrorism and the indiscriminate targeting of civilians. And I want to look at one specific aspect of what this has shown us in light of what's been happening since October last year, and the ramifications of what's been happening. But before that, I want to go into a little bit of historical context. When it comes to Israel and terrorism, one of the things to keep in mind is that Israel is a state founded on terrorism. This is a historical fact. This is not propaganda. This is not anti-Semitism. This is not blood libel. This is a historically documented fact. There were 3 paramilitary organizations. In fact, they are called paramilitary now, but I would happily call them terrorist organizations. The Irgun, the Lehi, and the Stern Gang. In the 1920s, in the 1930s, they were responsible for harassing, killing, and ethnically cleansing the Arabs, the indigenous Arabs of the land. 2 incidents that stand out, again, because I don't want to take too much time. One is the King David Hotel bombing, 1946. Some of you might know this. Those who don't know, go home and read. These terrorists, dressed up as Arabs, went into a hotel, planted bombs, and detonated. It was a hotel being used by the British at the time. 91 British soldiers died, or something similar to that. A lot of people died, and that was that. Interestingly enough, when Rishi Sunak visited Israel last year, they made him stay in that hotel to remind him what we did to you guys in 1940. We can do it again. There was another operation in 1946, Operation Cast Thy Bread, where the Israeli terrorists, they launched chemical warfare on the Palestinians. How? They released bacteria into the water wells that contaminated the water sources of the Palestinians. And again, you might think, well, really, did they do this? Yes, they did do this. It's been documented. In 2003, the documents relating to this started to get exposed. In 2023, an Israeli historian called Benny Morris, who is a Zionist, came across classified documents He was given permission to publicize them, and he came out and said, yes, we did this. How many years after? 70 years after? 74 years after? When you look into Operation Cast Thy Bread, a title given from a passage in the Bible where it said, cast your bread over the water, you find that in certain battles, this poisoning of the wells tipped the scale in favor of the Israelis at the time. In particular, there was one battle in the city of Akka, North Israel,